All right. So, some of the recent polling data that we've been getting on the 2024 matchup that absolutely nobody wants to see, Donald Trump versus Joseph Robinette Biden, has not been looking too good for Biden, especially given the fact that, his opponent, Donald Trump, presuming that he wins the Republican primary, which it looks like he's going to, is facing 4 indictments and upwards of 91 or more at this point, potential criminal charges, and not to mention his policy record being absolutely atrocious as well, but it sort of gives you an insight in terms of how weak Joe Biden is as a candidate. Some of his major weaknesses, obviously age is one of those weaknesses, and I think that's an entirely fair criticism, especially given the fact that his vice president, who he is sticking with for 2024, Kamala Harris, is the most disliked vice president in modern American history, which also adds to, age concerns, because then people are thinking, oh, if he doesn't make it through his next term, we could be stuck with Kamala Harris. So that's one of the concerns. Another major one has been his economic situation. Now, you could point to some victories that he's gotten throughout his term so far, Inflation Reduction Act, things like that, the CHIPS bill. So some of those things I think are decent bills. Some of those things I don't think go nearly far enough. But there's sort of been this weird reality where Joe Biden and people in his circle, White House representatives and other fellow, corporate Democrats who are backing him, are kind of trying to gaslight the American people on their own economic reality, where, a lot of Americans are saying that they are still feeling the brunt of inflationary pressures and other things like housing prices that I'll get to here towards the end of this video that are, still significant and are putting people in a really difficult position where a vast majority of the American people are still living paycheck to paycheck. And it's like, Democrats think that they can almost gaslight the American people into, pointing to different metrics and saying, look, inflation has slowed down or this and that that gaslighting is going to be enough to get him over the hurdle for 2024. And I think that that's an absolutely atrocious bet, especially considering some of the more recent economic numbers that we have been getting. So I want to start off here with this big one. So this ties in with the child tax credit that obviously expired. This was one of those pandemic era programs that was put in place, and it legitimately pulled millions and millions of people, children specifically, out of poverty, along with a lot of other measures that were put in place during COVID that also helped tens of millions of Americans to sort of get by and actually uplifted a lot of Americans for a temporary period. And then, of course, a lot of those programs ended up sunsetting thanks to many, fellow Democrats like Joe Manchin, who we'll get to here in a second. But a lot of those programs, basically, they just let them expire, right? And this was when you had Democrats in control of Congress, not the, split between the, Senate Democrats having control and House Republicans having control. This was under Democratic control through and through, and they allowed all of these programs to expire, and that led to a significant jump in poverty. So here from Axios, they got a little bit of a rundown. They say end of pandemic era safety net programs increased poverty. Oh, absolutely shocking, right? And they got a little graph here. So U.S. supplemental poverty rate among people under 18. So basically, children essentially, or teenagers. And you can see this sort of trickling down here a little bit. Then you have COVID sort of spikes off, and you have all of these programs that are implemented, and you see this poverty rate absolutely plummets temporarily. And then 2021, what do you know? The child tax credit expansion expires and immediately shoots back up to around 12.4%, which is really where we were 4, 5, 6 years ago at this point. So a little bit of details. They say the expected spike in poverty, particularly child poverty, between 2021 and 2022 shows the impact of letting major pandemic era safety net program expansions expire, a policy experiment with no precedent in the United States, which is a good point to point out here, right? Beyond just the politics of this, right? We're talking about a very rare example in American politics where, you can implement a program that is intended to do a specific thing, immediately see drastic, positive results from that program being put in place, and then you have the removal of that program, and immediately you see the results of that. It's very rare that you get a clean experiment like this, but we had that with the child tax credit, and again, you can see the results there. So, this is just one of those examples in terms of the scope of the Biden administration, right? Because again, you could say, okay, Biden has done much more in terms of positive legislation that has helped people than Donald Trump did. Okay, sure, I would agree with that. But if the trajectory of his presidency, right, he starts off, he's taking over, you're still sort of in the COVID era, and you still have a lot of these programs, and then as his administration goes on, those programs that were helping people start expiring, and then people aren't getting that help anymore. Even if, you can say, look at this inflation metric, inflation has been slowing down significantly. Well, you have the expiration of all of these different programs that were helping millions of people. Of course, people are going to look at that and they're going to say, wait a minute, even though you're touting all of these policies that you've managed to get passed, I still feel worse off than I did a couple of years ago. And so that is sort of the narrative that it seems like is deeply baked within a lot of Americans' minds. And again, the Democratic response to this is not to, go out and try to go to war to get the child tax credit implemented again, or any number of these other expansions that we had in the safety net during COVID. That's not what they're doing. Again, they're basically just trying to gaslight the American people and say, no, you guys just don't understand. Look at the GDP, look at all of these other metrics we're pointing to. The economy is actually doing phenomenally well. You guys are just wrong by saying that, you're not doing well economically, which is just a delusional strategy to try to implement here, right? Again, if you wanted to actually, uplift people, if you wanted to sell people on your economic pitch, go to war over things like this. I don't know why the fuck Democrats haven't just put up straight up like the child tax credit expansion as a single line item bill and just try to go to war over that and dare the Republicans in the House to, tank that bill. But no, they're not doing that. They're not even mentioning it at this point. And another reminder here is that, of course, the independent senator from Vermont, Bernard Sanders, was trying to do this exact thing. Oh, what do you know? Another example of, Democrats ignoring what Bernie Sanders was telling them to do, and then it coming back and biting them directly in the ass. So, I mean, this was, again, we talked about this at the time when this was happening. Democrats, basically worked with Republicans to block this effort. In fact, as they point out here, the independent Vermont senator was the only one in the Senate to vote in favor of an amendment to include the child tax credit as a part of this other bill that they were passing. Bernie was the only one, right? So when I say Democrats worked with Republicans, right, it's not like, oh, it's even just a couple of Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema or whatever. This was the entire Democratic Party saying, no, we don't want to have that fight over the child tax credit. So, I mean, again, credit to Bernie for once again being on the right side of one of those issues, but this is just one of those things that comes back to bite you in the ass. And I want to remind you guys, one of the, specific demons in this entire process, this was a different bill than they were just referencing there when Bernie, after the fact, tried to get the child tax credit back added in as an amendment to a different bill. But this was a different situation that Jamal Bowman is referring to here, calling out Joe Manchin, where he basically worked to try to prevent it from being re-upped when it was first actually going to end up expiring. And his reasoning was absolutely insane, but we'll get to that here in a second. I just want to read what Jamal Bowman said because I think that it's 100% accurate. He just points out some of the statistics here. He says, "Dear Senator Manchin, numbers don't lie, man. Because you let the child tax credit lapse, child poverty has increased from 5.2% to 12.4%. Let's just sit on that for a second, right? The wealthiest country in the history of the world, okay, the United States of America, and we have a 12% poverty rate for children in this country. Okay, what does that say about the structure of our economy under capitalism? What does that say about the corruption of our government, who, all of these politicians largely serve corporate America and do their bidding and couldn't possibly give this kind of help to working class people who are on the bottom rung of the ladder because, then they might not want to go to work anymore, whatever the fuck justification that they come up with. 12% poverty rate for children in the wealthiest country on the face of the planet." He says, "Great job," and I mean that with sarcasm and incandescent rage. "Democrats can get millions out of poverty and win big in November if we work together." Again, perfect example of, good policies actually being effective politically. Wow, surprise, surprise. You do economically populist left-wing items and get those through Congress, and people are going to see that, feel the impacts of it, and be more likely to support you. It's almost like that's how politics should work if we didn't live in a corrupt and rotten cesspool of a government here. So he continues, he says, "But instead, you and your comrade from Arizona, obviously Kyrsten Sinema, have joined the dark side to hold our progress hostage. 70% of Americans support the tax credit. 70%. He says, "After the White House expanded it in the American Rescue Plan, we succeeded in cutting all child poverty by 30% in 2021. It was huge for children of color too. Black child poverty fell by 52% in 2021. Hispanic child poverty fell by 46%, and Native American child poverty fell by 40%. I mean, just absolutely mind-boggling statistics that we have a government that could do something that is this wildly successful. Look at the data. Okay, overall we have a 30% reduction in child poverty, and instead of being like, oh, we managed to get a 30% reduction in child poverty, why don't we go for 100% reduction in child poverty? Our government sprinted full speed in the opposite direction and said, no, we need to spike that back up a little bit, right? We need workers, we need children in this country suffering just a little bit more." He says, "Where did you stand? Your vote to lapse this program was a betrayal of the American people, especially your constituents in West Virginia. West Virginia has one of the highest child poverty rates in the country. The credit would have helped millions of families in your state make ends meet and provide a better life for their children. Look at what we're losing. Children who grow up in poverty are more likely to have health problems, drop out of school, and commit crimes, they are also less likely to succeed in life, which again kind of cuts straight through this neoliberal or conservative economic sort of like ideology, where their solution to poverty is just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Same old Reaganomics, trickle down economics. You cut taxes for the rich, you deregulate the economy, and all of that good stuff, and eventually it'll trickle down to people, and those who pull themselves up by their bootstraps will succeed, and I guess just fuck everybody else. But it cuts through to that because, I mean, again, we had a perfect example here of how actual, left-wing government policy can legitimately help millions and millions of people and potentially level the playing field. And again, it's kind of like blowing through the lie of a so-called like meritocracy under capitalism. There is no meritocracy, okay, where the harder you work, the more you're going to get on in life, the better you're going to succeed economically in life. That's just a myth under capitalism. It's not possible because nobody is starting from the same exact starting line. Somebody who grows up in a wealthy family is not starting at the same starting point than somebody who is growing up in an impoverished community. It's just not a level playing field. This is one of those policies that could potentially, even marginally get us closer to an actual meritocratic system, even under capitalism, right? But of course, conservatives and neoliberals are mostly against that kind of a thing, right? But basically, I mean, I'll link this down below if you want to go and read through the rest of it. I'll read his last line here because I think it was good. He says, "Reverse course, man. It's the right thing to do, and it is the only thing that will make a difference for millions of families who are struggling. And if you continue to choose to be a disgrace to our party and to our country, then at least have the dignity to retire." And credit to Jamal Bowman for actually, calling him out directly by name, something that Joe Biden and White House officials never did throughout this entire process, and that's part of the reason why this was allowed to lapse at the end of the day. And also just as a reminder in terms of why Joe Manchin, or how Joe Manchin justified letting the child tax credit expire. I mean, one of the most grotesque justifications from a politician on a policy like this and I've ever seen in my life. Here from ABC News, Senator Joe Manchin suggested child tax credit payments would be used to buy drugs. Okay, this is what he did. This is a Democrat, right? Joe Manchin, who helped to kill the child tax credit expansion, right? He said they were going to use it to buy drugs. Now, not only is this just like ridiculous and ridiculous framing from him, he just pulled this out of his ass, but it's also like we have the data on this. We know exactly what parents were spending this money on. They were spending it on things like housing, on clothes and food for their kids, on just like basic life necessities. And he has the audacity to use this as a justification. I mean, think about what that says about his character, right? Who he actually, who he actually works for as a member of the government. He doesn't work for average people in West Virginia as much as he wants to posture as if that's what he does. No, he works for corporate America. Okay, and that's exactly why he decided to allow this to happen. And again, I'll finish off here just with this point on housing, as well as some of those other pandemic era programs that were allowed to lapse under the Biden administration. But here from CNN, they say home affordability is the worst it has been since 1984. Literal George Orwell 1984 moment here. Okay, so I mean, home affordability, worst that it's been in literally decades. Okay, all of these expansions that we had during the COVID pandemic era of the social safety net, all of those have expired and essentially dissolved at this point. You have a majority of Americans who are working paycheck to paycheck. You have an economy where literally less than a handful of people have more wealth than the bottom half of the country. Okay, so my pitch to the Biden administration, I guess at the end of the day, is if you actually want to have a legitimate chance against Donald Trump in 2024, do not like rest on your laurels, okay? Don't just tout like the Inflation Reduction Act, okay, or the CHIPS bill, or even some bills that I agree with to a large extent, even though they didn't go far enough. Don't just like sit back and expect that that's going to be enough to win the next election and sort of do like a victory lap and gaslight the American people who are feeling the brunt of how we have structured this economy, and sort of gaslight them and try to tell them that they're wrong for feeling that way. I mean, it is just, not only is it not true on like a real, statistical level if you look at the economic reality of the American people, but it's also just a delusional political strategy. I mean, it's one of the dumbest things that I could possibly imagine, because then you can just have Trump, who comes in, who is even more of a corporate stooge, who is even going to help, working class Americans less than Joe Biden, and you're giving him the ability to sort of form this narrative that like, look, Joe Biden says the economy's doing great. I don't think the economy's doing great. Vote for me and I'll bring us back to where we were a couple of years ago. And even if, it wouldn't be better under Trump, that narrative is going to sell, because again, you have this trajectory of the Biden administration of a lot of these programs expiring. People are feeling a little bit more nostalgic for a couple of years ago, and maybe they felt their economic reality was doing better. And again, you're just clearing the lane lane for somebody like Trump to use and abuse that narrative going into 2024. So, I mean, look, the polling data at this point, I've been saying this for a while, it's 50-50, okay? If it ends up being Joe Biden, it ends up being Donald Trump, it's a 50-50 fucking coin flip, okay? So, I mean, that's the reality for the Biden administration. You got to confront it at some point. Either Joe Biden shouldn't be the candidate because he's clearly not inspiring, especially to young people, especially with his age concerns and economic concerns as well. If he's not going to try to get through any other major agenda items until the 2024 election, either remove him from that position and definitely don't replace him with Kamala, or, figure some other shit out and actually try to, use your executive power, use the bully pulpit, go to war with Republicans, make it a clear dividing line on where exactly you stand on some of these policies, put individual policies like the child tax credit up and force a vote on that kind of a thing. I mean, you got to do something, man, because where we're at right now, honestly, if I had to put money on it, I'm saying Trump probably wins in 2024. And that's a problem that is Joe Biden's to solve, Democratic Party to solve, and nobody else is responsible for it if Joe Biden ends up losing.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying